A knight in shining armor never charged alone like in movies. Crusaders fought as organized war machines, using devastating shock charges requiring perfect coordination. Archaeological evidence reveals brutal executions after battles ended. What happened when formations collapsed? Picture this. A knight in shining armor charges wildly across a battlefield, screaming at the top of his lungs, completely alone against a sea of enemies. This is how most people think Crusader warfare looked. But the real story was far more planned out, organized, and brutal than any movie has ever shown. Today we're diving into the bloody truth of how Crusaders actually fought their battles in the medieval world. When you think of Crusader combat, forget everything you've seen on screen. These weren't wild warriors charging blindly into death. They were careful, organized fighting machines who knew that staying alive depended on following orders, not on being individual heroes. An Arabian warrior named Usama ibn Monk, who actually fought against the Crusaders, complained about his enemies in a way that might surprise you. He said, "Of all men, the Franks are the most careful in warfare." Careful, not brave, not fierce, but careful. That tells us something really important about how these battles really happened. The secret weapon of Crusader armies wasn't just courage or religious passion. It was the shock charge, a devastating battle move that required incredible teamwork and perfect timing. Picture hundreds of heavily armored knights thundering across a battlefield in perfect rows, their long spears lowered together like a moving wall of death. But here's what makes this terrifying. It only worked if every single rider stayed in their position. One knight breaking formation could destroy the entire charge and turn victory into massacre. These weren't individual warriors looking for glory. They were tactical units called conroys. Small groups of knights who trained together, fought together, and often died together. Multiple conroys would combine to form larger battalions, creating a military machine that could adapt to almost any battlefield situation. The proof of how smart they were lies in one of the most amazing military achievements in medieval history. When Crusader armies first met Muslim horse archers, they faced a completely different kind of warfare. These mounted enemies would rain arrows down on them while staying just out of reach. A tactic that had destroyed countless armies before, but rather than fall apart under this pressure, the Crusaders did something extraordinary. They studied Byzantine military tactics and successfully copied them on their first try. This wasn't luck or desperation. This was the work of highly trained, smart military professionals who understood that adapting meant survival. Now, let's talk about what these warriors actually wore into battle. Because the reality was far more brutal than any costume designer could imagine. A typical Crusader soldier during the First Crusade wore a coat covered in metal scales attached to leather or cloth. Over this went a chainmail shirt with long sleeves, hand protection, and a collar that could mean the difference between life and death. On his head sat a cone-shaped helmet attached with leather straps, often featuring a nose guard that gave him the appearance of some armored bird of prey. But here's where things get interesting. This equipment designed for European warfare was completely wrong for the blazing heat of the Middle East. Imagine marching across desert sand while wearing what was basically a metal oven. The Crusaders quickly learned to adapt, using lighter chainmail and adding cotton-padded caps under their helmets to deal with the brutal sun. The weight of this equipment tells its own story. A fully armed Crusader carried so much metal that quick movement became nearly impossible. Their heavy swords, lances, and armor created warriors who could devastate enemies in close combat, but struggled with speed and endurance. This meant that every battle became a race against time. Could they get close to the enemy before getting too tired? Could they keep their formations while weighed down? Like pack animals? Archaeological evidence from medieval battlefields reveals something important about where these warriors aimed their weapons. Excavations at sites like the Battle of Tonn show that most soldiers died from multiple severe head wounds. This makes perfect sense when you understand medieval armor. Since chainmail and plate protected the chest, the head became the main target. Stepping onto a medieval battlefield without a helmet was basically suicide, which is why even the poorest soldiers found ways to protect their skulls. But individual combat was only part of the Crusader military machine. These armies faced a challenge that would test every aspect of their organization: siege warfare. Unlike the quick, decisive field battles we see in films, most Crusader campaigns revolved around the slow, grinding process of taking fortified cities. Consider the siege of Acre during the Third Crusade, a brutal affair that lasted almost 2 years. The city was surrounded by massive walls and defended by towers that seemed to scrape the sky. When the Crusader army of Gata Lusignan arrived, they didn't immediately attack the walls. Instead, they did something that shows how methodical medieval warfare really was. They dug in. The Crusaders surrounded Acre with their own fortifications, creating ditches and moats that turned the siege into a city within a city. They understood that taking a fortified position required patience, engineering, and overwhelming resources. When reinforcements arrived from the west, they brought not just fresh soldiers, but the materials needed to build massive siege engines. The French contingent tunneled beneath one of Acre's great towers, a process that took months of dangerous underground work. Meanwhile, other Crusaders built catapults so large they gave them names. The French called one of their siege engines God's Own Sling, a machine capable of hurling stones heavy enough to crack fortress walls. But the real key to Crusader success at Acre wasn't their siege weapons or their courage, it was logistics. While Saladin's army tried desperately to break the siege from outside, Crusader ships continued arriving with supplies, reinforcements, and ammunition. The Muslims found themselves caught between the city's defenders and the Crusader siege lines, unable to effectively support either position. This brings us to perhaps the most important aspect of Crusader warfare that no film has ever properly shown: the absolutely critical role of supply lines and logistics. Medieval Europe had lost the Roman skills of military logistics centuries earlier, and Crusader armies had to relearn these lessons in the harsh deserts of the Middle East. The reality was simple and brutal. An army could carry about a week's worth of food for the soldiers, but nothing for the horses and pack animals. These beasts needed 4 to 6 hours of grazing every single day, which meant that every march had to be planned around finding adequate grass and water. Many Crusader armies were defeated not by enemy swords, but by empty stomachs and poisoned wells. Muslim commanders like Saladin understood this weakness perfectly and used it as their most devastating weapon. When Richard the Lionheart arrived in the Holy Land during the Third Crusade, he brought something that set him apart from previous Crusader leaders: careful planning. While earlier armies had starved in the desert, Richard arranged for supply ships to follow his forces as they marched along the coast. His success came not from superior fighting skills, but from superior organization. But Saladin was equally brilliant at this deadly game of logistics. When Richard finally attempted to march inland toward Jerusalem, he discovered that the Muslim leader had systematically destroyed everything in his path. Wells were poisoned, crops burned, livestock driven away. The countryside had been turned into a barren wasteland, where an army could only survive for days before collapsing from starvation. This forced Richard into one of the most difficult decisions of his military career. Despite having one of the best supplied and most disciplined armies of the entire Crusader period, he realized that besieging Jerusalem would mean watching his men die slowly of hunger and thirst. The two greatest military minds of their generation had effectively checkmated each other through logistics alone. The contrast with Muslim military organization was stark and often decisive. While Crusader armies struggled with supply lines stretched across thousands of miles, Muslim forces operated with sophisticated logistics networks, using thousands of camels and mules. These supply columns included not just food and weapons, but doctors and medical equipment, giving Muslim armies a crucial advantage in the brutal wars of attrition that defined Crusader conflicts. But what happened when all the planning, all the logistics, and all the tactical formations finally came together in actual combat? Recent archaeological discoveries have given us a disturbing window into the reality of medieval battle. At Sidon Castle in Lebanon, archaeologists uncovered the remains of soldiers who died during the 13th century attacks on the fortress. These weren't clean deaths from Hollywood sword fights. The skeletons tell a story of absolute brutality that no film has ever dared to show. Some bodies bore sword wounds across the backs of their necks, suggesting they were captives executed by beheading after the battle had ended. Others had been cut down from behind while fleeing, their spines severed by pursuing enemies. These weren't glorious warrior deaths. They were the panicked final moments of young men who realized their formations had collapsed and death was inevitable. The wounds covering these medieval soldiers reveal something crucial about Crusader combat. When disciplined formations broke down, when the careful tactical planning failed, medieval warfare became a chaotic slaughter where survival often depended more on luck than skill. This archaeological evidence destroys one of the most persistent myths about Crusader warfare. These weren't individual heroes dueling with enemy champions while armies watched respectfully from the sidelines. Real medieval combat was a desperate struggle where soldiers targeted the most vulnerable points on their enemies' bodies with ruthless efficiency. The Crusader military machines succeeded not because of individual courage or religious inspiration, but because of systematic organization, careful planning, and brutal efficiency. The truth about Crusader warfare isn't found in tales of individual heroism or divine intervention. It's found in the careful records of supply lists, the strategic placement of siege engines, and the grim archaeological evidence of what happened when medieval military science met the brutal realities of combat. Remember the poisoned wells and the careful supply lines. Remember the shock charges that required perfect coordination, and the siege engines with names like God's Own Sling. Remember the young soldiers whose bones still bear the marks of wounds they received 800 years ago. That's how Crusaders really fought. And now you know the truth behind the legend.